I spotted Marcus at Sarah's birthday dinner the second I walked into that restaurant in Denver, and I knew immediately he was different from the usual losers I'd been wasting my time with. While everyone else was ordering cheap wine and splitting appetizers, this guy casually ordered a bottle that cost more than most people's car payments. The way he talked about his logistics company, the Rolex on his wrist, the fact that he drove himself there in a brand new truck instead of taking an Uber like some broke college kid. Everything about him screamed stability and success. Finally, a real man with his shit together. Sarah kept trying to introduce me to her cousin's friend who worked at some dead-end marketing firm, but I wasn't interested in another guy who'd expect me to go Dutch on dinner dates. I positioned myself right across from Marcus and made sure he noticed me laughing at his stories, asking intelligent questions about his business. The other women at the table were too busy gossiping about their coworkers to pay attention to what was right in front of them. Their loss. Honestly, by the end of the night, Marcus was walking me to my car and asking for my number. Easy. Our first few months together were exactly what I'd been looking for. Marcus knew how to treat a woman right. Real restaurants. Weekend trips to Aspen, never making me feel cheap or unwanted like those other guys who thought Applebee's was fine dining. He was 35, established, ready for something serious. Not like the man-children I'd been dating who were still figuring out their careers and living with roommates. When Marcus talked about the future, he meant it. When he said he wanted to build something lasting, I could see it in his eyes. The only frustrating part was how slow he moved with everything. We'd been together 8 months, and he still hadn't brought up marriage, even though it was obvious we were perfect for each other. All my friends were getting engaged and planning weddings, and I was tired of being the only single one at every event. It's hard to keep a good man interested when there are desperate women everywhere just waiting for their chance. I started dropping hints about how nice it would be to have that security, that commitment. Marcus would just smile and change the subject, which was honestly pretty rude. When we hit the 1-year mark and he still hadn't proposed, I had to be more direct. I told him exactly how I felt, that all my friends were married, that it was hard to keep a good man out here with so much competition, that I needed to know he was serious about us. Some women might think that was pushy, but I prefer to call it knowing what I want. Why waste time playing games when we both knew this was going somewhere? Marcus finally got the message and proposed 2 weeks later with a ring that was absolutely perfect. Everything was falling into place exactly like I'd planned. Then came the prenup conversation, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Here was this man who claimed to love me, who just asked me to be his wife, and now he wanted me to sign papers basically saying he didn't trust me. The whole thing made me feel like he didn't believe in us, like he was already planning for our marriage to fail before it even started. I cried for hours trying to explain how hurtful it was, how it made everything feel like a business transaction instead of a love story. But Marcus just kept saying it was standard procedure, that it protected both of us. All this cold business talk that had nothing to do with romance or commitment. His lawyer kept explaining all these clauses about assets and alimony. And I felt like I was being treated like some gold digger instead of the woman he wanted to spend his life with. But what choice did I have? I loved Marcus, and I wasn't about to let some stupid paperwork ruin our future together. So I signed it, even though it felt like swallowing glass. At least once we were married. None of that legal stuff would matter anyway. Marriage changes people. It makes them more generous, more willing to share everything. The wedding was beautiful. Everything I'd dreamed of since I was little, Marcus spared no expense. And I felt like a princess walking down that aisle. All my friends were so jealous of the venue, the flowers, the band he'd hired. This was what real love looked like, a man who would move heaven and earth to make his woman happy. Our honeymoon in Italy was perfect too. Just the two of us exploring vineyards and staying in hotels that cost more per night than some people make in a month. I kept thinking about how lucky I was to find someone who could give me this kind of life. 6 months into marriage, I was completely burned out from my job at the insurance company. The stress was killing me, and it didn't make sense for me to keep grinding away at some meaningless career when Marcus was doing so well with his business. He never actually said I should quit, but I could tell he liked the idea of having me home more, available for dinners with his clients, able to keep the house running smoothly. When I told him I needed to step back from work for my mental health, he was completely supportive. That's the kind of husband he was, always putting my well-being first. Being a wife was wonderful at first. I had time to decorate our house exactly how I wanted, to plan elaborate dinners, to actually enjoy my life instead of rushing around like some stressed-out corporate drone. Marcus would come home to candles and wine and a woman who wasn't exhausted from dealing with idiotic coworkers all day. This was how marriage was supposed to work. Him handling the business world, me creating a beautiful home for us to share. We were a team, each playing to our strengths. But after a while, the routine started feeling a little predictable. Marcus was so focused on work that our conversations revolved around his business deals and client meetings. He'd come home, we'd eat dinner, watch something on Netflix, and go to bed. Rinse and repeat, day after day. Where was the passion we'd had when we were dating? The excitement of discovering each other? I started feeling like I was married to a schedule instead of a person. Marcus was reliable, stable, safe. But safe can be another word for boring when you're only 31 years old. I wasn't looking for anything to happen when Sean reached out on Facebook. We'd been divorced for years, and I figured there was no harm in catching up with someone who used to be such a big part of my life. Sean had always been different from Marcus, more spontaneous, more emotional. The kind of guy who would surprise you with random road trips or show up at your door with flowers just because. Talking to him reminded me of what it felt like to be truly desired. Not just appreciated like some piece of furniture that makes the house look nice. Our conversation started innocently enough, just reminiscing about old times and catching up on what we'd both been doing. But Sean remembered things about me that Marcus had never even noticed. How I used to love dancing. How I'd always wanted to learn photography. Dreams I'd had that got buried under the weight of being a proper wife. With Sean, I felt like myself again instead of just Marcus's wife. He made me laugh in ways I'd forgotten were possible. When he suggested we meet for coffee to continue catching up in person, it seemed harmless enough. That first coffee turned into lunch the following weeks, which turned into longer conversations about everything we'd both been through since our divorce. Sean told me he'd made mistakes, that he'd grown up a lot, that seeing me again made him realize what he'd lost. The way he looked at me was like I was the most fascinating woman in the world, not just someone who happened to share a house with him. Marcus looked at me the same way he looked at his quarterly reports, with mild satisfaction and complete predictability. I started telling Marcus I was visiting my mom when I was really meeting Sean. It wasn't like we were doing anything terrible, just talking, remembering what it felt like to be with someone who actually saw me as a person, instead of a wife-shaped accessory. Sean understood parts of me that Marcus had never even tried to explore. When I complained about feeling invisible in my own marriage, Sean knew exactly what I meant. When I talked about missing excitement and spontaneity, he didn't just nod politely and change the subject like Marcus always did. The conversations with Sean got deeper and more honest as weeks went by. I found myself telling him things I'd never shared with Marcus, feelings I'd been burying under the routine of being a good wife. Sean listened like every word mattered, like understanding me was the most important thing in his world. We'd spend hours on FaceTime after Marcus went to bed, just talking about everything and nothing. I started keeping my phone face down during dinner because I didn't want Marcus seeing Sean's messages lighting up the screen. Marcus began asking questions about my mom visits, wondering why I was going over there so much when I'd barely seen her twice a month before. I told him she was going through a rough time and needed extra support. Which wasn't technically a lie, since my mom was always complaining about something. He seemed to accept that explanation. Though I noticed him paying more attention to my schedule than usual. Men can be so suspicious over nothing. When Sean suggested we spend a weekend together, just to see if what we were feeling was real or just nostalgia, I knew it was a risk. But I also knew I'd regret it forever if I didn't find out what could happen between us. Being married to Marcus felt safe but boring, like living in a beautiful museum where you couldn't touch anything. And Sean made me feel alive in ways I'd forgotten were possible. I deserved to feel that electricity again. That sense of being truly wanted and desired. I told Marcus I was going to spend the weekend helping my mom clean out her garage, and he barely looked up from his laptop when I kissed him goodbye. That should have told me everything I needed to know about the state of our marriage. His wife was leaving for the weekend, and he was more interested in spreadsheets than spending time with me. Sean, on the other hand, had planned every detail of our time together. He'd booked a little cabin in the mountains, brought wine he knew I loved, remembered exactly how I like my coffee in the morning. Those 2 days with Sean were like stepping back into my real life after months of sleepwalking through someone else's routine. We talked until sunrise, laughed until our stomachs hurt, felt like teenagers again, instead of adults trapped in boring responsibilities. Sean told me he'd never stopped loving me, that our divorce had been the biggest mistake of his life, that seeing me married to someone else had been torture. When he kissed me, it was like coming home to myself. I wrote Sean an email after that weekend, trying to put into words everything I was feeling. I told him how being married to Marcus felt safe but empty, how Marcus was too perfect in all the wrong ways, how Sean made me feel alive in ways my husband never could. I needed Sean to know that what we had was real, that it mattered, that I was willing to figure out how to make it work between us. The email was long and emotional and completely honest about everything I'd been feeling. What I didn't know was that Marcus had been checking up on me in ways I never imagined. Apparently, he'd installed some kind of tracking software on my laptop, had been monitoring the mileage on my car, even put cameras around the house to see what I was doing when he wasn't home. The level of paranoia was honestly disturbing. When I got back from that weekend with Sean, glowing and happy for the first time in months, Marcus was waiting for me with printed copies of every email I'd sent. The look on his face was something I'd never seen before. Cold and distant and completely unforgiving. He didn't yell or throw things or demand explanations like most men would have done. Instead, he just stood there holding those papers like evidence in a court case, staring at me like I was a stranger who'd broken into his house. When I tried to explain that it wasn't what it looked like, that Sean and I were just working through old feelings, Marcus cut me off with a voice I barely recognized. "Save it for your ex-husband," he said, "or maybe your next one." Then he handed me a manila envelope that turned out to be divorce papers, already filed and ready for my signature. I couldn't believe what was happening. This was the man who'd promised to love me through everything, who'd stood in front of our friends and family and vowed to work through whatever challenges came our way. Now he was throwing away our entire marriage over some emails and a weekend that didn't even mean anything in the long run. I tried to explain that marriages go through rough patches, that people make mistakes, that what Sean and I had was just nostalgia and confusion. But Marcus wouldn't listen to anything I said. He'd already made up his mind, already talked to lawyers, already decided that our whole relationship was disposable. The man who'd been so patient and understanding about everything else in our marriage couldn't find it in himself to forgive one moment of weakness. The divorce process was brutal and humiliating. Marcus's lawyers used that prenup like a weapon, making sure I walked away with basically nothing, despite everything I'd contributed to our life together. They acted like I was some kind of criminal instead of a confused woman who'd made a mistake. I got no alimony, no claim to the house I'd decorated and maintained, no recognition of the sacrifices I'd made to support Marcus's career. The prenup protected him completely, while leaving me with nothing to show for 2 years of marriage. Meanwhile, Sean completely disappeared the moment things got complicated. The man who'd been telling me he loved me and wanted to build a future together suddenly stopped answering my calls when I actually became available. Apparently, sneaking around with a married woman was exciting, but dealing with a divorced woman who needed real support was too much responsibility for him. So much for all those promises about never stopping loving me and regretting our divorce. I had to move back in with my mom, which was humiliating at 33 years old. All the friends I'd made through Marcus vanished the moment the divorce was final. And my old friends were too busy with their own lives to deal with my drama. The life I'd built, the security I'd found, the future I'd planned. All of it disappeared because Marcus couldn't handle the fact that marriage takes work and forgiveness. Months went by, and I kept expecting Marcus to come to his senses, to realize that throwing away a good marriage over one mistake was insane. I sent him emails on our anniversary, pouring my heart out about how sorry I was, how much I missed him, how everyone makes mistakes and deserves a second chance. But he'd blocked my number, blocked my email, blocked me on every social media platform like I was some kind of stalker instead of the woman he'd promised to love forever. The rejection and isolation started eating away at my mental health in ways I never expected. I'd wake up every morning in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of my failed life, wondering how everything had gone so wrong so fast. Dating was a nightmare. Men would ghost me after a few weeks, or they'd stick around just long enough to sleep with me before deciding they weren't ready for anything serious. Nobody wanted to commit to a divorced woman with no career and no place of her own. I had what my mom called a breakdown, though I prefer to think of it as a period of adjustment to some really difficult circumstances. For a few weeks, I couldn't get out of bed, couldn't eat, couldn't see the point in showering or getting dressed when there was nowhere to go and no one who cared whether I was okay. My mom got scared and called Marcus, begging him to help me, to at least talk to me since I'd been asking for him. He wouldn't even take her call. The 3 days I spent in the hospital were probably the lowest point of my entire life. Here I was, a woman who'd had everything just months before, now being treated like some kind of mental patient because my husband had abandoned me and my ex-husband had used me. The doctors kept asking about my support system, and I had to admit that I didn't really have one anymore. Everyone had written me off like I was the villain. in some story where I was really just a woman who'd made a mistake. Now it's been years since the divorce, and I still can't understand how Marcus could be so unforgiving. I see him around town sometimes, and he looks right through me like I don't exist. He's expanded his business, started hiking, lost weight. Apparently, getting rid of me was the best thing that ever happened to him. Meanwhile, I'm still trying to rebuild my life from nothing. Still dealing with the consequences of one weekend that didn't even matter in the end. I tried calling him recently from different numbers since he'd blocked mine, just wanting to have one real conversation about everything that happened. I wanted to tell him that I missed the sound of his truck in the driveway, the way he made coffee every morning, the feeling of being safe and cared for. I wanted him to know that I understand now what I threw away, that I'd do anything to have another chance to be the wife he deserved. But Marcus won't give me that chance. He's moved on completely. Like our marriage was just some business deal that didn't work out, instead of 2 years of building a life together. I keep thinking that eventually he'll remember the good times we had, the connection we shared, the future we'd planned. Someday he'll realize that everyone makes mistakes, and that real love means forgiving each other and trying again. Until then, I'm stuck living with the consequences of choices that seemed so reasonable at the time. Sean turned out to be exactly the same selfish person he'd always been, just better at hiding it when he wanted something. Marcus turned out to be exactly as cold and unforgiving as that prenup should have warned me he could be. And I'm left wondering how a woman who just wanted to feel alive and appreciated again ended up losing everything that actually mattered. The whole situation taught me that men will promise you the world when they want something from you. But the moment you need understanding or forgiveness, they'll find reasons to walk away. Sean wanted excitement without responsibility, and Marcus wanted a wife without the messy complications that come with real human emotions. Neither of them was willing to fight for what we had when things got difficult. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd just stayed in that boring routine with Marcus, never reached out to Sean, never tried to recapture that feeling of being truly desired. Maybe I'd still be in that beautiful house, still married to a successful man, still secure in a future that felt predictable but safe. But then I remember how empty I felt in that life, how invisible and unappreciated, and I know I would have withered away completely if I'd stayed. The truth is, I deserved better from both of them. I deserved a husband who would fight for our marriage instead of running to lawyers at the first sign of trouble. I deserved an ex-husband who would stand by his promises instead of disappearing when things got complicated. I deserved friends who would support me through a difficult time instead of judging me for one mistake. But apparently, that's not the world we live in. Now I'm starting over at an age when most women have their lives figured out, trying to build something from the wreckage of choices that seemed so right at the time. Maybe someday I'll find someone who understands that real love means accepting people's flaws and working through problems together. Maybe someday Marcus will realize what he threw away when he threw away our marriage. Or maybe I'll just have to accept that some mistakes have consequences that last forever. No matter how sorry you are, how much you've learned from them,